Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Alexis, the co-founder of the podcast, once again, and the host here today. I am solo. I am by myself, but I'm actually pretty excited. We are going to be talking about a topic today that I've literally wanted to talk about since we started the podcast. Gosh, two years ago now? Maybe even more than that. So I'm pretty excited about this one because it's one I've been thinking about for a while, but I finally dedicated some time to doing some research on it, to actually thinking about it. So I'm really excited, and as we go through it, you'll see that I kind of have a personal connection to it that we've kind of alluded to a little bit on the show before, but I'll get into a little bit more. I'm thinking specifically of the episode that my dad did with Eric in terms of the Human Genome Project. He alluded to something that we're going to touch on today because it is something that affects me personally. But a little overview of today's topic before I go into our little break to hear from one of our supporters of the podcast. We're going to be talking about today William, Duke of Gloucester. And if you're not familiar with who that is, he's one of the lesser known royals, and yes, he is from that favorite country of mine, but he is one of the lesser known royals from that country. He is actually the son of Queen Anne, who reigned in the 18th century, the 1700s, and her husband, Prince George of Denmark. He is actually the only child to survive to a significant age. As we get through in the topic today, you'll see that she had quite a few children, was pregnant quite a few times, but William, Duke of Gloucester, was the only one that really had a significant span of life. And we're going to talk about his life and how things might have been different if he had lived past his death date in the timeline, how that would have affected British history, world history, and how it would have changed things moving forward if he had not died at the early age that he did, that we will get into. But first, we are going to take a brief little break to hear from one of the partners of the show that helped make it possible. See you after the break as we talk about William, Duke of Gloucester, and how things would have been different if he had survived.
Here's Don.
And Alexis.
Taking just a quick break from the podcast today to tell you about, again, something that is relatively new for us. So what is this new exciting thing that we're sort of pumped about?
Merchandise.
We're a podcast.
They can have those. They can have items.
Wow, this opens up a whole new world of possibilities. And so what we're referring to here is the fact that you may have been absolutely craving, wondering how in the world you could get your hands on what? Maybe a Fork in Time
T-shirt.
Or coffee mug.
Yeah, coffee mug is a big thing for me.
Or maybe even a cell phone cover or a tote bag or any of the other types of things there. The good news is now you're able to do that. And we found a way to do that works well for us, and we think that will work well for you. So one of the folks that we partnered with is TeePublic. And TeePublic is actually a place for designers to sort of post things that are graphical or art-oriented. I got this idea from another podcast that does this. So we're able to have our logo as an option that you can then put on the various TeePublic apparel. Mm-hmm. So, Alexis, how does it work if you go to our website and click on the link that says get some logoed stuff?
So when you click on that link, it'll take you to the TeePublic site, and you can pick from several different options, which we kind of mentioned. There are other ones too, so you can really pick what you want with our logo on it. And then when you purchase that, we actually get a little help.
Yeah, it's not a lot. This is not going to be I'm not retiring on our TeePublic income ever. But it does offset a little bit of the cost of the show. But more importantly, it's a way of doing this where we don't have a lot of upfront cost in terms of printing, 1,000 T-shirts, because that's the way you get the best rate. So it's just a good way of doing that, taking advantage of the mechanism that TeePublic has in place. So if you enjoy the show and you want to rep the show to those around you, you have a way to do that through logo apparel and items and all kinds of other stuff. And you can find how to get there by going through the website. So one more time, what is our website address, Lex?
That is aforkintimepodcast.com. You can use that merchandise, and also it'll help you start a conversation with somebody about the podcast, too.
Hey, there's an idea. So we hope that you do. Thanks.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. As I mentioned before the break, this is Alexis in the pilot seat today, going, of course, to my favorite country. You can probably guess where that is if you've listened to the podcast for a while. But as I mentioned also before the break, I'm really excited about this topic. This is a topic I've been thinking about for a while. Got a personal connection to it, so I hope you enjoy this topic as much as I enjoyed kind of thinking about it and doing the research on it. Today we're talking about William, Duke of Gloucester. I mentioned briefly before the break, but of course, as we always do here on A Fork in Time, before we can get into the what if, we got to go through a little bit of the what did. So let's talk about who William, Duke of Gloucester was, why he was important, and why his short life had such an impact on history. So William, Duke of Gloucester, he is the son of Queen Anne, who is Queen of Great Britain from 1702 to 1714, and her husband George, the Prince of Denmark, who dies in 1708. But they are rulers of Great Britain, Anne specifically, along with her husband, and William is their son. Now, also alluded to this a little bit before the break, William is special in relationship to his mother, Queen Anne, because he is the only one that survives out of her multiple pregnancies and children. It is thought that she was pregnant at least 17 times that we are aware of. There might have been some pregnancies that she miscarried so early in that pregnancy that we don't necessarily count it as a pregnancy or realize it was a pregnancy, but there are 17 documented pregnancies that we know of. And of those pregnancies, there was either miscarriages, like I mentioned, where the baby died before it was a viable pregnancy. There were some stillbirths where the baby was born deceased, or there were even some instances where the baby was born alive but lived either a few hours up to a few days before passing away. So William is special in that he survives past that period. So he is not a stillborn, he is not a miscarriage, and he survives past those few hours or few days. He is born on July 24th of 1689, and when he is born, he's really seen as this cementation of the Protestant succession and the Protestant legacy of England. In 1688, we're going to backtrack a little bit more. In 1688, we have what's called the Glorious Revolution. So in 1688, James II, who is sitting on the throne of England, he actually converts to Catholicism. And the people of England, the Parliament of England, decide they do not want a Catholic monarch on the throne of England. So there is this coup, essentially, that is formed where James's daughter Mary is invited along with her husband William, who are in Orange, which is modern day Germany, Holland area at the time. But they're living in Orange. They are invited to come over and take the throne from her father James because they are Protestant. So they're seen as the legitimate, and I'm using air quotes there, but the legitimate rulers of England because it is decided they do not want a Catholic ruler on the throne of England. So Mary is invited over because she has the claim to the throne. She is James's daughter, but she comes over with her husband, and it is decided they are not going to. She is not going to defer to her husband. He is not going to become king by right of marriage to her. And she is not going to take the throne by herself. It is decided they're going to rule jointly. So she becomes Mary II of England. Her husband becomes William III. So they take the throne in 1688. So in 1689, in July, when William is born, he's really seen as this continuation of that Protestant succession. William and Mary at this point have no children of their own. So her sister, Mary, James II, did have two daughters from his first marriage to Anne Hyde, and those daughters were raised Protestant. We have Mary, and then we have her sister Anne. So when Mary is on the throne of England, her sister Anne is really seen as the heir presumptive. It's assumed that if Mary and her husband William have no children, that Anne will take the throne following their deaths. So when she has a child, when she has William in 1689, just the year after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, it's really seen as a justification of, okay, we're good, this is great, we've got a Protestant heir to the throne now, this is fantastic. Unfortunately, in the real timeline, we have a problem because, as I mentioned, William and Mary have no children. That doesn't change. They both die childless. Mary dies in 1694 of smallpox. A few years later, in 1702, William passes away. So Anne does become queen in 1702, and she rules till 1714. But, as I mentioned, we have a slight problem because in the real timeline, her son, William, Duke of Gloucester, dies at just 11 on July 30th of 1700. So now we're having this Protestant queen come to the throne, but she has no heir. Her heir has passed away. Now, I mentioned she is pregnant multiple times, and she does try to get pregnant again after the death of her son, William. She's actually pregnant about 10 more times after William, but no baby survives more than briefly after it's born. Again, those few hours or those few days. So in 1701, we have the Act of Settlement, which ultimately places the line of succession on the Protestant heirs of... We have to go backwards a little bit. We have to go back to James the First. And so it is determined that Sophia, who is now the present Electress of Hanover, again in Germany. I mentioned that Orange is in Germany. It is not. It's in the Netherlands, but Hanover is in Germany. So we have Sophia, the Electress of Hanover, who is designated as the heir to the throne of England. Unfortunately, she predeceases Anne by just a few months, actually. It's not that long. But since she predeceases Anne, we have her son, George, coming to the throne of England in 1714 after the death of Queen Anne. That, of course, institutes the Hanoverian succession because they're coming over from Hanover. So we have George I, followed by George II, George III, George IV, and it continues until present day. We have Elizabeth II, who is a direct descendant of the Georges that come over from Hanover after we have to do this kind of, we use this term all the time on the podcast, the cousin jump, over to get to the next Protestant successor to the throne of England after Anne passes away with no heir because her son, William, Duke of Gloucester, predeceases her. So that's kind of the what did in history. We have Queen Anne coming to the throne in 1702. She rules until 1714. But unfortunately, she dies without an heir because her one and only child that really lives long enough to be considered a viable successor to the throne, William, Duke of Gloucester, dies at the age of 11 in 1700 before she actually becomes queen. So, what does this do to the line of succession? And what would have happened if William had not passed away at the age of 11? So let's jump into that what if. Let's get into our what if machine, which I get to drive today. Before we really get into the what if though, we really need to talk about William's health. I mentioned that he does live until the age of 11, which is much longer than any of his siblings live. But there are some issues. He was described as a lively child, but that's probably more to do with the fact that he was the heir to the throne. So it was kind of seen as that's what you say about heirs to the throne, is that they're lively, they're healthy, they're strong, they're robust, they're fantastic. However, very shortly after he is born, at just 3 weeks old, he becomes ill and has convulsions or seizures. It is thought that this may have been a symptom of meningitis that he had contracted. However, this results in a condition called hydrocephaly. This is where the topic becomes very, very personal for me because I actually have hydrocephaly as well. If you're not familiar with what hydrocephaly is, hydrocephaly basically means fluid or water on the brain. That's the two words, hydro meaning water, cephaly meaning brain. You might also hear it called hydrocephalus. There is a US at the end of the word, but I always call it hydrocephaly. And it does really affect it affects gross motor skills, but it also affects intellectual abilities as well. It can affect intellectual abilities as well. Again, I'll kind of get into my personal story a little bit and why I found this topic so fascinating. Because it does kind of affect kind of both sides of the coin, so to speak. It does kind of affect motor skills, but it can affect intellectual skills as well. With William Duke of Gloucester, he wasn't really able to walk properly. He was delayed in walking, and even at the age of 5, he refused to go up and down stairs without having someone on either side of him because his balance was not great. He was worried about falling. So it definitely did affect his his motor skills. His language acquisition was also delayed. He couldn't really speak correctly or fully until he was 3. And that's also something that's common with hydrocephaly. It's affecting intellectual abilities. So that's kind of something with me. I mean, my parents found out that I had a condition that they when it got diagnosed on the ultrasound before I was born, it was like, we don't really know what this could mean for her. And then after I was born and they fixed that one issue, but then I also had developed hydrocephaly. Again, it was kind of like, we don't really know what this could mean. It could mean this, it could mean this, or it could mean nothing. She could be all the way, not able to be independent, all the way to being fine. I am pretty close to being fine. I'm very, very independent. I graduated high school, I graduated college, I work in the workforce on a daily basis. So I've lived a pretty independent life, but that could have very much not been the case. So that's kind of what happened with William Duke of Gloucester. He was very reliant on other people to do things for him, but he was not an imbecile by any means. He could speak, he could walk, he just had some motor issues and some developmental issues, but he wasn't a mute, he wasn't deaf, wasn't completely incapacitated. So, and it's actually thought that he didn't actually die from complications from his hydrocephaly. He actually probably died from smallpox or from some kind of fever that had set in. But it is kind of thought that his hydrocephaly would have probably affected him had he lived a little bit longer. He, of course, I mentioned he dies at the age of 11, just past his 11th birthday. So it is kind of thought that if he had lived a little bit longer, the hydrocephaly would have caused more problems for him, but he didn't actually die from the hydrocephaly itself. It's important to kind of make that distinction when talking about kind of the what did, and as we get into the what if. So let's kind of get into that kind of what if a little bit. There's kind of 2 ways you could take this. One, because he is diagnosed, or because he develops hydrocephaly so early, just at 3 weeks of life, there's kind of 2 thoughts with this. You could say, well, he just doesn't develop hydrocephaly. He doesn't get that infection, whether it was meningitis or something else. He doesn't get that infection that causes the hydrocephaly. Or he has the hydrocephaly, but he lives past 11 and is able to have a life, whatever that life would look like anyways. I'll kind of talk about both of those things, but there are kind of those 2 ways that you could take it. And it kind of was interesting in doing my research, which we can get into a little bit as well as we go through the what if. It is kind of interesting to think about when I was doing my research. A lot of people are like, well, he had hydrocephaly, so obviously it would have affected all these other things. Not necessarily. Again, hydrocephaly, there's a wide range of things that can impact. You have people who cannot be independent whatsoever, but then you have people that are closer to my end of the spectrum that are pretty much self-sufficient. Now, again, this is the 1700s, the early 1700s, really the 1600s that we're talking about. Obviously, medical advances were not to the extent that they are now, But I don't think it's fair to say that, oh, he had a hydrocephalus, so he basically would have been an invalid. I don't think that's a fair assumption because he could have still had a decently normal life. It would have been different than someone who didn't have hydrocephaly, but that doesn't mean that he wouldn't have been able to accomplish anything in life. So again, it's just interesting. I don't think you can do that broad a stroke on it. When I was doing my research, people were kind of using broad strokes, and I think it's a little more nuanced than that. So let's kind of talk about if he, if he doesn't die in 1700, let's kind of talk about the trajectory of his life, thinking through how long he could have lived. I kind of based my thoughts on this, kind of on the death of his father. So his father dies at the age of 55, which is pretty typical for that time period. It's not a vastly long life like we're used to thinking in 70s, 80s, 90s, but 55 is pretty good for the late 1600s, early 1700s. So let's say he dies at 55, the same age that his father dies. So that would put him dying in 1744. Now, in the real timeline, we have made that cousin jump. We are during the reign of George II, who's the son of George I, who's, of course, is the son of Sophia, who we've determined is the Protestant successor to the throne based on the Act of Succession in 1701. So, if we have William the Duke of Gloucester living to 1744 until the reign of George II in the real timeline, of course, we don't have a George I. We don't have a George II. We won't have a George III. And we won't have that line that comes from that. Again, it's a simple thing to think about, but just the fact that we wouldn't have the Georges, hence we wouldn't have Victoria, we wouldn't have an Edward VIII, we wouldn't have an Elizabeth II. So that's just a simple thing to think about. The people that become so synonymous with English history and with specifically, modern era English history. I mean, we're not that far away from the modern era as we're talking about the early 1700s. Those people that become so synonymous, they wouldn't exist. There'd be no reason. Or they would exist, but they wouldn't have the positions of power that they do. It's kind of on the reverse coin. I mean, we still would have had Sophia, who still would have had her son, who probably still would have had his son, who probably still would have had Frederick, Prince of Wales, who probably would have had his son, who wouldn't be George III, but would be another George doing something else. So it's not to say these people wouldn't have existed. They just wouldn't have held the positions of power that they do. So that's just an interesting thing to think about, and just a broad thing to think about. But the fact that these people, they would have existed, but they wouldn't have had the positions that they do. So let's talk about kind of William's marriage prospects as he continues to grow up. A lot of things when I was reading, people were saying, well, he wouldn't have had children. Again, he had hydrocephaly. He wouldn't have had, he wouldn't have gotten married. He wouldn't have done all these things. Again, I don't think that's fair. I think, first of all, there have been examples of incompetent or incapacitated kings and queens and rulers in the past. So even if William, the Duke of Gloucester, let's call him William IV, once he becomes king, upon the death of his mother, let's just say she dies in 1714 like she does in the real timeline, so he would have been king for 30 years. There is a precedent for a regency. Of course, we see that with George III in the real timeline. We have examples of incapacitated monarchs. George III, Charles VI of France, who's of course the one who infamously thinks he is made of glass. We have those people in history. So it's unfair, again, in my opinion, to say, oh, because he has hydrocephaly, you just have to take him out of the running of being king. No, he's still going to be king. Now, it might be a regency situation. Another thing, when I was doing my research, I saw it delays kind of the post of the prime minister coming to, prominence in Great Britain, with William Pitt, the older, William Pitt the younger, and, subsequently moving forward. I think if you have William IV, this William IV, William Duke of Gloucester, becoming king, I think there's a chance that that timeline gets expedited even more because he might be this weak, feeble, needing help king. There might be that power vacuum, so to speak. And because we've kind of moved forward a little bit in history, maybe there's that opportunity for those ministers in Parliament and in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords to really galvanize their power, and the Prime Minister might actually become a more prominent feature quicker in history. We're used to thinking about it in concert and in context of the Georgians coming to power. But if you have this weak king that needs this help, is it possible that the Prime Minister becomes popular in 1714 and in the 1720s sooner than in the real timeline, or becomes a little more prominent a little bit faster than if we're having to wait kind of with the Georgians to come over and establish their succession and their line of rule. I think that's not a far cry to see the Prime Minister coming, kind of rising to power a little bit quicker because they're having to help this monarch that might need a little bit more help. Of course, we have this king, and again, even though he might have hydrocephaly or might have an issue where he is needing some help ruling, all my research that I've done, and I've even done this research for my personal life, again, when I'm doing my research, it's like, again, he wouldn't have had children, he wouldn't have gotten married, because he had hydrocephaly. Like, no king would put their daughter in that situation to go marry this king. Well, again, we're not sure what his hydrocephaly would have manifested as. Would it have only affected his gross motor skills, and he might have taken a little bit longer to talk, but he did talk, and he was relatively articulate. Was it just gross motor skills? Was it a little bit on the intellectual side? We don't really know because he died so young. We don't really know how the hydrocephaly would have affected him later on throughout his life. And there's no evidence that even though he had hydrocephaly, there's no evidence that he would not have been able to father a child, or that he wouldn't have had the capacity to father a child. So I don't think it's a far cry that you see him getting married and furthering his own bloodline. There is some evidence that hydrocephaly might be genetic, but there's also several other things that cause hydrocephaly. Meningitis, which is how he contracted it. So just because he contracted hydrocephaly doesn't mean his children are going to inherit it, doesn't mean any of those things. So he gets married. Well, now the question becomes, who does he get married to? Of course, we have that Act of Succession in 1701. Not only does it bar Catholics from taking the throne of England, but it bars them from marrying a Catholic. So, again, kind of doing my research, William III goes to war with France during his reign in the 9 Years' War. He then makes peace with France. So one of the things I saw suggested was that he marries a French princess to kind of, bridge that gap and cement that alliance and cement that treaty. Problem: France is Catholic. So I don't really see him marrying a French princess, unless there was a forced conversion situation. That does happen where it's like, you can marry me, but you have to convert to my religion. Again, we're talking about the Act of Succession. We have an example of that closer to our modern day. Peter Phillips, who is the son of Princess Anne, who is the daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, when he got married, and he's about to get divorced, or has gotten divorced, I believe, but when he got married to his wife, Autumn Kelly, she had to convert to Catholicism. If she had not converted, Peter would have lost his place in the line of succession. We also have some instances that their names are not immediately popping to my mind, but they actually did lose their spots in the line of succession because they did not marry someone who chose to convert. Autumn did. Other people have not. Subsequently, they've lost their rights to the line of succession. So that forced conversion is a possibility, but I don't really see it being that prominent. But there are a few options on the marriage market in Europe that are Protestant. One of them is Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. This is actually the daughter of the man who becomes George I in the real timeline. There are some issues with this simply because Anne is not a fan of the Georgians. She doesn't really get along with Sophia, the Electress of Hanover. She kind of begrudgingly sees her as her heiress simply because she's closest kin relation that's Protestant. But they don't really, they're not best buds. So I don't really see Anne being super gung-ho about her son marrying essentially Sophia's granddaughter. However, it's possible that William III might have overranked Anne and said, "Hey, this is happening." It's just interesting to think about, and it's one thing I should mention. It's like, well, William dies in 1702, so it's where are we? Like, how much pull does he have to tell William, the Duke of Gloucester, that, hey, you're going to marry this person now, because they're so young. I mean, in 1702, he would have been only 12, or actually 13, depending on when he was in the year. However, it's not uncommon for princes and princesses to get married that young. Granted, as we've gotten into the 17th century, or the 1700s, the 18th century, marriage ages have kind of increased a little bit. We see people getting married in their late teens, early 20s. They're not as much getting married very, very young and then waiting to consummate the marriage. However, that doesn't mean it's completely out of the question. So it's an unlikely scenario, but it's kind of the one that my brain likes to go to easiest. I think that's because if we have William, the Duke of Gloucester, marrying Sophia Dorothea, we merge the timelines eventually. We merge the what if with the what did. If we have William, Duke of Gloucester, marrying Sophia Dorothea, of course I mentioned she's the daughter of George I, who doesn't become George I in this timeline. He just becomes a George. He's the Elector of Hanover, which the Georges as we know them, George I, George II, George III, they do also become the Elector of Hanover. So George is the Elector of Hanover. But William, Duke of Gloucester, and Sophia Dorothea, did they have a son, George? So their George is now George I. I think that it's where my brain naturally wants to go, although this other part of my brain is fighting it because I know there's this issue between Anne and Sophia that is going to be hard to overcome. Some other options are Ulrika Eleanor of Sweden. In the real timeline, she becomes the wife of Frederick I of Sweden. Or we have Sophia Louise of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, who in the real timeline becomes the wife of Frederick I of Prussia. So we do have some options in terms of marriageable princesses in the European market who are Protestant. But again, my brain just naturally wants to go to Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. She's the daughter of George I in our timeline. He would have been George the Elector of Hanover in this timeline. Again, even with those issues with Anne, I think she would have gotten over those because we do see that thing of marrying cousins. I mean, William and Mary, they're cousins. That's why people were a little more accepting of William, was because he wasn't this out there person that Mary had married. He was a nephew of James II. He just happens to also be his son-in-law. So again, that's kind of where my brain wants to go, and I see Sophia Dorothea becoming Queen of England, and I see them having, now I don't see them having a ton of kids, which is interesting because when we think of the Georgians, we think of these huge, big families. I think there would have been a similar pattern to maybe Anne, maybe William's mother, where she might have been pregnant multiple times, but I think they would have had one, maybe two, maybe three children that survive. But again, I see kind of the timelines melding, and we just, move the Georgians up. We still get the Georgians, and so this way, in this weird way, we do get kind of the same people. We just come to them in a little bit different way. So again, the person that we know, the people that we really know is as George the First doesn't exist. The person that we would now know as George the First is the son of William, the Duke of Gloucester. I keep wanting to say the William, the Duke of Cumberland. That is not right. He is the Duke of Gloucester. But the Duke of Gloucester and Sophia Dorothea, so their son becomes becomes George the First. He has a son, George II. So we might eventually get to an Elizabeth II, but she is not the same Elizabeth II who is sitting on the throne of England. So that is just our brief little jaunt down this little alternate path of history today. Again, I've always kind of been interested in this topic because I was just interested to find out that there was a famous person in history that also had hydrocephaly and lived with hydrocephaly for a while. So I've always been interested in William, Duke of Gloucester, and I just kind of wanted to talk about what would have happened if he had lived past the age of 11. I really love the fact that he, died from something else. He didn't die from those complications of hydrocephaly. That probably would have affected him at some point, but I think it's just really interesting to think about how things would have been different if he had survived, and kind of the implications of having to do that cousin jump over to Germany. And then, of course, we still to this day, we have a German family essentially on the throne of Great Britain. If we do that, but do that in a little bit different way, they might not be seen as German. And I'm using air quotes there because, we have this Sophia Dorothea who's in the line of succession. I mean, she's the daughter of the person and who we know is George the First, who's the son of Sophia, who's the descendant of James the First and the Stuart line. So she's English, essentially, which is why they have the legitimacy to the throne that they do. But I think you would have seen this little more of a legitimacy if they're marrying into someone who is quintessentially English. William, Duke of Cumberland William, Duke of Gloucester is really, really fundamentally British. So even if you have this marrying into this German line, it's not as much of a stark departure, and it's a little bit more of a gradual kind of easing into, and not just we had to jump over to Germany and grab these people and bring them over. It's we melded into the German line a little bit more, and not just jumping over immediately. So it's just a different way to think about it, a different way to, again, on paper you think like we ultimately get to the same place that we ought to, but when you really think about it, we didn't get to that same place. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. But again, I always have been fascinated by William, Duke of Gloucester. So I hope you've enjoyed this little jaunt that I've gone on today. We invite you to go onto our website, which is aforkintimepodcast.com. We have our forums there. You can interact with this topic or any of the other topics that we've talked about on the show. Of course, we have our social media. We have Facebook. We have Twitter. We're on Instagram. We're still building up that Instagram, so bear with us as we kind of get going on Instagram. But that's a great way for you to interact with the show as well. If we see a post, we're going to interact with it. I'll interact with it. My dad will interact with it. We love interacting with you that way. That's also a great place for you to share the podcast. We always post the link to the show, so if you want to share it out, if you find a topic interesting, think you know somebody who might find a topic interesting, we invite you to do that. We're actually recording tonight the inaugural episode of The Room Where It Happened. very, very excited to get on that episode as well with some of the people that you've heard on A Fork in Time that are going to make the jump over to the room where it happened. But of course, it is not too late for you to get involved with either the room where it happened or even A Fork in Time. There's a place on our website if you want to be involved with either of those podcasts. You can fill out the form that we have there. You can shoot us a note. You can be involved in a lot of different aspects of it. If you want to be doing research, if you want to be doing stuff on social media, if you want to be doing some production work, if you want to actually have your voice out there like we do, and get your voice heard, we'd love to have that as well. So if you want to get involved, go on over to the website, aforkintimepodcast.com, fill out that form, and then we will connect with you and get you involved with us, because we'd love to have you. As we always say, we're building a community here. We've loved building that community over the last couple of years, so we want to keep growing it as we keep adding to our podcast repertoire here. But I'm really excited to get the room where it happened up and off the ground. So hope you enjoy that as well. Again, we have our Patreon page, so if you'd like to support the show financially, or the room where it happened financially, now that we're getting that second podcast off the ground, we'd love to have you there. You can go to patreon.com/aforkintime podcast. All these links are going to be in the show notes as well, so if you just want to click on the show notes, you can look for it there. But of course, the best thing that you can do to support us is to give us your time. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank you for listening. We really appreciate it. Again, we've loved building this community over the last couple of years. We know that it's been a little hectic, particularly with this last year with COVID, and we've got things going on in our life. But I always love coming back to the podcast and getting to interact with our listeners and with all of you. So really hope that you stick with us through kind of the stuff we've got going on. And know that y'all are really important in what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to close out the show. I'll close out the show the same way we always do, which is to say that if you happen upon a fork in time, our suggestion is you take it. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.